And I would like to congratulate you with the Dutch translation of your new book, A Far Country, which is published by De Bezige Bij, Een Ver Land. I'm very happy you're here tonight, and I hope we will listen also to your great new book. I would like to introduce to you as well Hans Stekkete. He is arts editor for NRC Handelsblad, and he will moderate this evening. He had a very exciting day today, and I hope you will survive this evening. Maybe you can step forward and introduce Mr. Mason.
Ladies and gentlemen, and Daniel Mason as well. First of all, I would like to read to you a small passage from Daniel Mason's first novel, which some of you will already be familiar with. It's called The Piano Tuner, and it was published 5 years ago when the author was just 27 years old. And his book has since then been translated into 30 languages. Now, as you will know, this novel tells the story of Edgar Drake, a piano tuner who travels to Burma to tune an 1840 Erard piano, the piano Beethoven and Liszt and Ravel played. The piano is owned by Anthony Carroll, who is a peculiar officer in the British Army and who is also a forward thinker on malaria and other diseases. Carroll is seen as being crucial to the British conquest of remote areas and tribes in Burma, which is why his strange requests, first to have a piano in the remotest part of the Asian jungle and then to have it tuned, are granted by his commanders in London. Things are not what they seem, and the piano tuner is sucked into a sequence of adventures which ultimately seal his fate. The piano, on the other hand, disappears in the rain, floating on a raft on a river, and is never heard of again. Or is it? Now, I have to get this book, and I have to apologize as well for having lost my English copy. So I'm translating here off the cuff from the Dutch translation back into English. So apologies for this, Daniel. Correct me if I'm wrong, okay? So here's Daniel Mason. As a final chord, long after I had started this story, I traveled to a place north of the area where I did my research into malaria. I went to Mae Siam Leap, a little town on the Solween River, downriver from the imaginary place Mae Luin. There I sailed on a long bumboat, dat is een parlevinker, a long bumboat along forested, very quiet banks where we stopped by Koran villages hidden in the jungle. It was very hot that afternoon, and the air was very still. But from a muddy trading post on the banks of a small river, a strange sound came from the thick bushes. It was a melody, and before the engine started running again and we set off from the bank, I recognized the sound of a piano. Maybe it was just a gramophone recording that came from a dusty old gramophone that are still for sale in some remote markets. Perhaps, but in any case, to my ears, the sound of the piano was very shrill, out of tune. Well, so far, Daniel Mason. Technically, these lines do not belong to the novel, since they are part of the author's note at the end of the book. But I do think that this note is an important part of the book, which could not have been left out. Because contrary to what the author writes and thinks, I thought the piano playing classical music sounded quite melodious. By making this sound, recorded or not, the era piano directly speaks to us again. And with his author's note, Daniel Mason reminds us of the fact that his story is not just fiction, but that it could have been true. He's remarked on this a couple of times, and I quote from an interview with Bold Type, which is the online magazine of his publisher, Random House. And I quote here, the real Daniel Mason, so much of The Piano Tuner is about the interplay of truth and fantasy, and since I drew virtually all of the background of my story from historical fact, I was always haunted by the idea of what would happen if somehow this story actually was true. On a number of occasions, I had experiences in which my book seemed to meet me in life. I learned recently of a modern Burmese piano tradition tracing from the mid-19th century, most likely brought by an Italian ambassador rather than a British army officer. And when I was in London, I found a list of piano tuners' names in a directory at the time, and a real chill ran down my spine when I ran my finger down the list of D's. Alas, no Edgar Drake. Hearing the piano music was like suddenly leaving this world and entering that of my story. End of quote. Well, as a reader, I had exactly the opposite experience. It was as if the story somehow was so powerful, it pushed itself out of the book and entered reality. This tension between fiction and reality, historical or otherwise, is in my opinion one of the driving forces of Daniel's first book, and also of his second novel, which he will introduce to us tonight. It's called A Far Country, and I won't say too much about it, just that we'll be discussing it at length later on. But first, Daniel will speak to us for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then we will start a discussion which we will open to you as soon as we can, and finally you will of course be able to buy his books over there at the they're on sale by De Bezige Bij, and perhaps have a word with the author himself. So it's with pride that I ask your attention for Daniel Mason. Daniel.
Hi. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you to the De Bezige Bij and the John Adams Society, and thank you, Hans, for that extremely generous and detailed introduction, which is not common, which is really unusual. So it means a lot whenever, I think for any author to hear that their book has been read so carefully and thought about so carefully. I'm going to pick up, I guess, where Hans left off and talk about my new book, which just came out about 3 weeks ago in the United States, A Far Country. And I thought what I would do, I guess because Hans sort of left off with the postscript to the Piano Tuner, is to start again with the with sort of the preamble to this book and how this book came about to be written. Because I'm still pretty new to the process of writing, and I think that the first book came around rather accidentally. I hadn't written before, and as I sort of started writing, each day was an extremely new experience. This one, on the other hand, was completely opposite. For the first time, I actually had the task of writing a book in front of me, and I think probably, as you may have heard other writers say, when you're supposed to be doing it, it's extremely different than when it's sort of coming naturally. That it has to be planned, and one wonders when starting out how planned the book really should be, or how much space you should give for the characters and the narrative to sort of take over themselves. I ended up having to give a lot of space because the story that I started writing was a completely different story than the story that this book ended up being. When I finished The Piano Tuner and had a chance to write a second novel, was given that offer, I was at the time reading about the Portuguese voyages to Brazil, which was a very interesting subject to me at the time, and not really knowing how one went about writing a novel, since the first one was just a subject that interested me at the time. I thought, well, maybe that's the case. One takes a period in history that's interesting, take a fictional character, set that character within the historical place, and if the history is interesting enough, it'll carry the story and the character will emerge. And so I got on an airplane and I went down to Brazil to research the voyage of Pedro Alvarez Cabral. About 4 months into researching Pedro Alvarez Cabral, I began to have this strange feeling that this wasn't the novel that I wanted to be writing or shouldn't be writing, or perhaps it wasn't a novel at all, which is a pretty disconcerting thing for someone who's trying to start a book for the second time, to all of a sudden find himself faced with the possibility that this task is a little bit more than sitting down and wondering what appears on paper. But I didn't admit this at first. I went traveling around further and researching the story further. And as I was going around the country, every time I would go to like a small backlands town looking for somebody who could help me out, who knew a little bit of that history, I would learn that the person was very often not in that small town anymore, but had left and migrated to the city. And this narrative was repeated over and over again. I would arrive in a small town, and there was someone I heard from that small town who knew traditional ghost stories, which I wanted to include in the story. I would ask where they were, and they said, oh, she's gone to Sao Paulo, and she lives now on the outskirts of Sao Paulo. Or I'd ask about someone who knows about traditional farming in the area, something that maybe I wanted to use for the story if I was going to talk about the people encountered during the discovery. And someone would tell me, no, that person would be a great person for you to talk to, but they've picked up and they've gone to live on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro. And all of a sudden, this whole geography began to be created of people who had picked up from where they once were, packed up their things and migrated to the cities. But not only them, but also these essential components of was essentially the pre-modern, very traditional world. And I was increasingly fascinated by the idea that not only the woman who told the ghost stories no longer lived in the area that the ghosts live, she lived in the city, but also the ghost stories had picked up from the countryside and moved to the city. So that the ghost stories of the backlands were now being told in the shanty towns on the outskirts of these gigantic cities. And as I began to travel further, thinking more and more about the European voyages of discovery, that story began to haunt me and what was happening with these worlds that were being pushed out of their traditional rural lifestyles and into the modern world. And this had interested me when I lived in Thailand, which was the experience that gave birth to the piano tuner, seeing in Bangkok at nighttime how the city completely changes with workers who don't even speak Thai, speak traditional languages from the mountains, coming into the city and occupying this incredibly urban space. Or in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live, how in the East Bay, near the boatyards in Richmond and Oakland, you can find communities from Louisiana and Mississippi that have been completely uplifted and transplanted to the eastern part of the Bay Area, so that there you can find differences in dialect between two towns in Louisiana living side by side on the same block in part of Oakland. And those communities that were once there in this rural landscape with its incredibly rich, very specific cultures have suddenly been uplifted and placed into a completely different place, and that the fights that once went on home in the small village in Louisiana now are going on the streets of Oakland, that the love affairs that once went on in little villages in Louisiana have now been rekindled in Oakland, the food that was eaten there is now being eaten in Oakland, or at least trying to be prepared in Oakland with the food that you can find available. So this idea fascinated me, and as I began to see more and more of it in Brazil, I eventually decided to abandon that first novel about Pedro Alvarez Cabral, take the many pages that had been written at that point and put them away, and focus instead on this other story that had begun to obsess me, which was the idea of what goes on in the internal world of somebody who once came from one of these traditional cultures, had been uplifted, essentially had that world torn out from beneath them and transplanted to a modern world where all the tools that they'd once relied upon, really essential tools, because to grow up in the bayou is a very difficult experience, yet it won't serve you so well in the streets of Oakland, just as surviving repeated droughts in the Brazilian backlands won't necessarily serve you in the city. Trying to find out what goes on in the minds of that person, and essentially in the mind of me and the people, the sort of mythological almost people that I once came from as they moved out of a prehistoric world, prehistoric in a very literal sense, a world without dates and a world without time, and into the very modern one. And probably about a year into this sort of very vague thinking and note-taking, I began to think about the story through the eyes of a particular character who's a girl who always varied between the ages of 14 and 16, someone on the cusp of adulthood, who, no matter how I tried to tell this story in my own mind, no matter how I tried to take notes, it began all of a sudden always to occur in the third person and always occur as a she. And her presence soon became inescapable. And I thought then this story that I wanted to tell would have to be told through her point of view, that she would somehow be the one to encapsulate this experience, an experience which was in a way larger than her, but that the story would be about the experience of one person going through this transformation. So 4 years later, the book's done. It turned out to be a much more difficult book to write than The Piano Tuner, something also I wouldn't have expected. Perhaps because I found that when one decides to take the perspective of a character who comes from a different world, at every single turn while writing it, with every single sentence, with every single movement of the character, my assumptions about what the character would do had to be challenged for something which didn't happen with the first character. So that if tonight we had this very nice dinner, we're talking about how if Isabel, who's my protagonist, were there, her approach to dinner would be entirely different, that she perhaps would be stunned into silence by either the richness of the food, she would be driven to distraction by the presence of music in the background, completely confused by the clothing worn by other people in the restaurant. I don't know, they're all possibilities and I have to think about them all. But she became such a mystery to me and still remains such a mystery to me that the story really is motivated by her and about her and imagining her. And I'd like to read from a portion of the book. I'd love to read a part which contains more about her, since, as I've said, she's so much the focus of this story. But at the same time, she's very much made of the place that she comes from, which is this very dry backland area of a country which ultimately I left unnamed in this story. That's hit continually by a series of droughts, and the book begins with one of these droughts, and the family leaving, and then eventually the family returning to their home. But I think that, because I'm only going to read for a short period of time, that in order to create her, I always find that so much of that background is needed because she's so composed of that place, that if I pick up from another part in the story, she always feels empty. She's incredibly quiet, and her movements are incredibly quiet. And so, sort of, I guess sadly in a way, I won't read about her. Instead, I'll read about something that she sees, which is once she gets to a city where she migrates. What's happened up until this point is that her brother, who's her beloved companion, inseparable companion in the backgrounds, her older brother, 7 years older, named Isaiah, has gone to the city during one of the worst droughts, during a point of political crisis, of sort of land conflict with the landowners, has gone to the city to work or try to find work. And when the situation's worsened, Isabel, my protagonist, has been sent after him to try to find work there. Arrives, though, and finds that her brother Isaiah is missing. And eventually the story begins to revolve around the question of whether she'll be able to find him again, and once she begins to search him out. But the point where I'll pick up is really once she's just arrived in the city, and she finds herself living in an area that's just called the settlements, which are part of this vast shanty area on the outskirts of the city. And for much of the time when she arrives, she's just watching. She's so completely confused and bewildered by the place that she's ended up in that she's just watching. And in this scene, she watches the local people, most of whom have all moved to the city, also from the north of this country, as they head down out of the settlements on the outskirts of the city to the center of the city to begin their work in the sort of unending cycle of their days. If you do have the book in front of you, it's on page 130. In the morning, sitting on the doorstep with Hugo on her lap, she watched the people descend from the settlements and crowd the buses to the city. They were day maids and factory day shifters and construction men. At night, others came down, the cleaners of factory plants and girls who said they were waitresses, the night shifters and night guards. The buses were full in the morning. There were long lines, and the fare collectors packed the aisles as tight as possible. The buses lurched through the city, rumbled forward in traffic, swung tight curves. dove into tunnels, shook until they seemed ready to fall apart. Sometimes they broke down, abandoning their fares in worried crowds that set off walking for the nearest stop. In the industrial neighborhoods, the factory day shifters got off first, filing into looming steel amphitheaters. They donned light blue bonnets and face masks and took up their places on the factory lines, where they soldiered in showers of sparks, turned, clamped, cut, twisted, dipped, sprayed, bolted, hammered, lathed. Until the end of shift bell rang, stopping only for lunch on the cold aluminum tables of the company cafeterias. The construction workers got off at crowded street corners, boarding unmarked vans trawling for day labor. On the tops of skeletal towers, they touched talismans of St. Barbara and wrapped shirts around their heads to protect themselves against the sun. The maids rode all the way to the center, where they changed for buses to leafy districts with electrified fences. They stood before cameras and let the guards buzz them in. The guards were their brothers, or their cousins or neighbors in the city or from the towns they'd fled during the droughts. They rode service elevators up terraced apartments called Villa Italia, Le Beaumont, and Edificio Cezanne, and learned to shadow the movements of gilded women in dark sunglasses. They mopped the same floors they had mopped the day before and washed lipstick from Danish crystal. At lunch, they carried silver trays and smiled politely and listened from the kitchen door to stories of Parisian parfumeries and tans in Miami. When their bosses left in chauffeured cars, they went to the balcony and watched the distant airplanes, smoked and flicked the ash with secret pleasure toward the sapphire blue of the swimming pools below. Then the maids folded up their aprons and took the elevators back down. The construction men laid down their tools, and the factory workers shook out their hair from the, it's the smoke of the city. And the factory workers shook out their hair from the light blue bonnets, removed their gloves and masks, and filed out of the great buildings, where they caught the buses back to the periphery, shouldering their way out through the night workers waiting to get on. The buses went back. Now the watchmen crowded in with cleaning women, factory night shifters, and girls who said they were waitresses. The women who were old and free from the tyranny of once being beautiful watched the girls tug on their short skirts with a mixture of sadness and anger. The night guards also watched the waitresses, inhaling their heavy perfume as the bus swayed. They also felt sadness and anger, but they felt desire too, which made the sadness and anger stronger. The girls, who were shift workers in the factories and still not freed from beauty's tyranny, watched the waitresses and saw the necklaces, nail polish pumps, and the men's eyes travel to the edges of their skirts. The girls who were shift workers in the factories remembered the first time a friend whispered, "They aren't waitresses," and learned how much they made. Time and again they considered the possibilities, but said no, which they told themselves was a final no. But each night they reconsidered as they rode into the center. They told themselves with pride, "I would never do that." They make more by suffering more, and they rubbed their elbows and wrists, swollen from turning and clamping and cutting and twisting, and their rashes from dipping and spraying, and they wondered if this was true. Then they told themselves, it is a different suffering, a soul suffering, and they thought of the great cold rooms and the whir of motors that made all conversation impossible, the mask that kept the dust out but also kept them from smiling to one another or mouthing words. They told themselves, but it is dangerous, and they thought of the gears and belts and flying metal shards and friends who lost eyes and hands to mechanical things that couldn't hear them scream. The girls in the short dresses saw the girls in their factory clothes, and remember the first time they heard of the grinding monotony of the plants. They thought, I won't do that. I won't slave for a month for what I make in a week. And they thought of their faces pushed into the rotting carpets of cheap motels in minutes that seemed like hours. They told themselves, I would die of the boredom, and thought of the same foul words from the same men, the same musty smell below the same bellies, the same haggling, the same damp beds, the same sharp edges of broken tile floors, the same mildewed ceilings. Then they told themselves poverty is worse, minimum wage is worse, and they thought of the cost of lipstick and stockings that the stupid men tore in fits of false passion, and the price of contraception and injections of penicillin. Then they thought in the end, but I am beautiful and shouldn't work in a factory, and stared at their reflections in the vibrations of the glass. They joined buses from other corners of the periphery as they descended on the center. Now it was the cleaners of the industrial plants who got out first, on the corners of empty blocks with graffitied walls and barbed wire. They watched for shadows as they walked to the gates, waiting as the guards fumbled with the lock. In the black and echo of empty corridors, they mocked and sang childhood songs from the north, thought of home and watched the rectangles of sky for dawn to come. Then the night shifters got off and took up spots on the factory lines and turned and clamped and cut and twisted and dipped and sprayed until the end of shift bell rang, stopping only for midnight lunches on the cold aluminum tables of company cafeterias. Next were the guards, who left meal tins in supply closets and checked the chambers of their guns. They waited in the empty lobbies of the black marble banks and watched the entrances. They imagined figures moving through the dark. They learned that if you stare long enough, you see men where there aren't men, that in the darkness of the empty lobbies of black marble banks, the night men emerged from the artificial palms, the swirls in the marble, the reflections in the floor. They knew that some guards never learned to tell the difference between real men and the night men who appeared and disappeared and would never rob anything. They laughed at stories of friends who broke the glass on alarms or fired rounds into the marble, who, trembling, tried to explain what they had seen. They said they would never do this, and fantasized at night of gallant rescues, newspaper headlines, and thankful executives who emptied coffers of gratitude into their hands. The last to get off were the girls, who walked until they were beyond the lights and then stopped to tug their skirts above the white triangle of their underpants and pace the shadows of the overpasses, to smoke anxiously as they walked towards cars idling at the edges of the dark sidewalks, where in the morning they caught the buses once again for home. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for reading this passage. Now, can I start by asking you talked about Brazil a couple of times, and you have talked about the book as being set in Brazil in interviews and so on, but it is never really mentioned in the book. It's actually, it gives the impression as if you have taken out everything that related to Brazil. Rio de Janeiro is mentioned once or twice, but that's all. You talk about the settlements and the backlands and droughts and so on, and Catholic names as well, and all. So this gives a definite Brazilian flavor. But it's not mentioned. So can you tell me why? Did you take it out, or wasn't it important to put it in?
Sure. So this in a way is the curse of the internet age, I think, in that the book, and probably also the curse of actually hearing an author talk about their work. For anyone who's here, I think that the book is meant to be read without knowing what country it might be, and without expecting a history, and without expecting nonfiction to enter the story. I think in my young and over-enthusiastic state at one point in time, when I was doing research for the second book and did some interviews, I sort of decided I wanted to talk about where I was setting the novel. And unfortunately with the internet, these then persist throughout the time, so I guess it would be pretty easy for most anyone looking for the story to figure out that that was an intent at one point. And at the same time here, in talking about the genesis of the novel, the truth is I was in Brazil. I was very much inspired by these particular events that happened, these series of droughts that happened. And that went into the story and inspired the story, but in the end I didn't want to be the story. There are a number of reasons for that to be the case.
Yes.
I think that for a long time I thought of setting it in a true historical place. And even after I decided not to write that novel of discovery, I still was very much driven, even though I had these influences from other places in the world, I was very much driven by the story of the droughts. These droughts were particularly vivid stories, and I think the book begins with that, and the first half of the book occurs in this drought land, and is very much about these characters' interaction with droughts.
Well, I thought it was striking because you really got me out of balance in the first part of the book, where you have these long, drawn-out scenes on the drought, and I thought this book is based in Africa because droughts is something you think of as taking place only in Africa. But then I realized later on that it also happened in the north of Brazil, around the equator and so on, not so much as in the Amazon.
Right.
And I thought, this is cleverly done. So he must have done it on purpose. But then I started to hesitate.
Sure. Yeah, I think that there, I hadn't known about that either when I'd first gone to Brazil, that there's this area where there's actually a whole vocabulary built around these droughts and what these droughts force people to do. So in Portuguese, they'll call it the retiro, which means the retreat. And actually these people are called retirantes, which is like the retreaters.
Yes.
And there's a whole mythology of what happened to these retreaters. And it's a very rich history. That's the thing that inspired
But now you mentioned the Portuguese name for it,
right.
Which you have studiously not done in the book.
Right.
You could have, instead of settlements, you could have used the word like favelas, which you haven't done either.
Right.
Or the sinteras, the people without any land.
Right.
So this made a very deliberate impression.
No, and it's very deliberate. And it was interesting that you read from my afterword and talked about the afterword actually being part of the piano tuner, because as I was writing this, I thought for a long time, what actually is the book here? Is the book just the part that I've written? Is it from actually the title up into the last word? Does it include the back matter and does it include the cover? Because in this case, I really didn't want to suggest this non-fictional component. And the reason was, I don't think that my character would experience the non-fictional world. And so if I took, say, Brazil as an example, the current history of land struggle in Brazil is extremely rich and complicated and confusing and leads to many different places. And so if the novel was a story about a person who was caught during the struggle for land in Brazil, what it would have done is it would have offered me as a writer and then also readers an escape from the very claustrophobic situation that protagonist Isabel finds herself in.
It would distract from the story itself.
It would distract from the story itself. That it would take away, that I want a person reading the book to be in exactly the same position that she's in, and that you don't know where you are. Like, she comes from a little town that is near another little town that has a television which sometimes plays, and it's usually not playing news. And so she's totally disoriented when it comes to knowing what kind of real events are occurring in the world. There's a war going on somewhere, someone mentions it, she doesn't know
as
what
we
it
are
is.
as readers.
And hopefully that's the case, right? That disorientation, like what country I am, where am I, what are the cultures and customs of this place, I think are essential for getting the kind of sense of entrapment that she would have, because I don't think that she doesn't have access to the current history of Brazil.
Yes.
So if I was to say this is Brazil, then you can go online and you can read about, on Wikipedia, the Sinteras, and you can find incredible rich literature about this, and you can see movies like City of God. Yes. You can supplement your world with all this information, which was very much an intention with the first book. Like, I love the idea if someone went and tried to learn a little more about Erard, which is an incredible piano, but I didn't want that to happen in this book because she wouldn't be able to do that, and I always wanted to return to the world that she's in. And so as a result then, a difference with this book and the first book is there is no afterword in this book. The only acknowledgments that occur in this book are in very small type on the print page, which includes the information for the Library of Congress, which I think it's pretty obvious is not mine. I felt pretty strongly with this that to add any of that, to add the sort of very common section of acknowledgments, which is a wonderful thing to do at the end of a book, which acknowledges friends and family who live in a very comfortable life in the United States, publishers in different places who live in tall buildings, would have taken away from this character who has no access to that world, would have essentially broken that sense of reality because it occurred within that same set of pages.
Yes. Well, I mean, obviously you did some research for this book. For instance, research into how people in the situations you described might feel and the kind of experiences they might encounter. But it's less obvious than in the other book. And the other book I felt at some point was slightly top-heavy with research. It's full of historical facts in letters and books you quote and so on. And I thought at some point this is a writer, a young writer, struggling with all the material he has, whereas this book is a sort of the opposite. There's all the factual ballast is gone from the book. So would you actually call this book more mature?
I mean, considering that the opposite would be that this book is more immature.
Well,
I
thought this is a young writer who is trying to prove himself, and he has taken this huge subject on board, and he wants to weave all the threads together into this huge tapestry, and he's struggling with it, and on occasions you can actually see you struggling to fit all the things in.
No, I feel that that's very much the case with that. I feel with the first book, I had this sort of enthusiasm about suddenly being able to take ideas that I had and fit them into a fictional structure, and all of a sudden this was fun.
Yes.
I hadn't been able to do this before, so let me put in every single interesting thing that I could possibly find without stopping, I think, at many points and asking this question, which has become the sort of essential question now, is like, is what I'm adding, is it essential for the fictional part of the story, or is this just some other interesting thing that I wanted to mention at this period of time? And I think sometimes it's fine, like, a story can be anything, it can be top-heavy. I do agree in this case with the piano tuner that, like, had I wouldn't write it now, but that's probably the case of most writers, and should be the case of most writers. So I don't even want to say that if I had the choice I would go back and I would take some of that out, because I think that if I would go back and try to write it, I couldn't even write the book. That there's a certain, the character has a certain naivete, this sort of seeing the world for the first time, that he wants to consume everything, and he's overwhelmed with things. And fortunately, that was a good character to be writing about when you're young and writing a book for the first time and sort of overwhelmed with the information and adding stuff in. But I definitely, in writing this book, had that in the back of my mind. I thought that, last time I put a lot of interesting things in the book, but are those interesting things right for fiction, or are they better for nonfiction? And what am I, as a fiction writer, actually bringing to the table here that's different from a non-fictional writer?
Yes.
I mean, there recently was a great book that came out about the history of Burma that does the history of Burma much better than I could do the history of Burma in the piano tuner.
Yes.
So in retrospect, I would say I would wish I had asked more of that question. What can I bring to this that's different than a person who's dealing with history? And I think that, so this book was a similar situation, and that was one of the reasons why I decided to strip it of the history.
Yeah.
Of what a fiction writer can, the experience of migration is like a vast and complicated experience that many people in nonfiction are writing about, and that I couldn't compete with. That I shouldn't be putting numbers in this book, I shouldn't be dealing with facts in this book, because those can be dealt with somewhere else. But the internal world is what a fiction writer can be able to address. And maybe the internal world is someone you don't know, and so that's what this story was very much focused upon. But again, I felt, especially in the early stages of this book, very much felt my age in having sort of gotten myself into a situation which was probably more complicated than I imagined, very honestly with this.
Yes.
That to write about a character whose primary interaction in the world is not through language, when you as a writer have as your primary tool language, is a difficult situation to find yourself.
It's a very strange thing, because you might argue that all these facts and historical figures and so on might give the book a sort of down-to-earth feeling. But both books, different though they are, have at times the same sort of dreamlike qualities. Do you agree with that?
I agree very much that the first one is meant to have these sort of fugue states in which the character drifts off into another world. This one, I think I'm in a tough position to imagine it, because the country, although it seems, I think, to any reader like to be like a different country, like this certainly isn't the United States, this certainly isn't Holland, because it's like the place that I've inhabited for the last 5 years, it feels much more physical and real to me than the first one. So that in the first one, if on page 300 of the first book, I was to interject a line there that said, and then he woke up and learned that it was all a dream, I mean, I don't think it would have been a good move, but fair enough. I don't think you could have found anything in the first part of the book that could have argued against that.
Yes.
Whereas it's hard to imagine that in this story. She's been torn out of her situation and she doesn't know where she is. And she tends to kind of, she has an interaction with what people from her community will explain as sort of like the other side or some sort of spiritual world, sort of like this almost religious but very physical place that they live in. And she at times crosses into that, which I think has this dreamy feel to it.
Exactly.
But at the same time, then she comes crashing down into it. So it's, in a way, it's almost like this is an answer to the other one. It's like the realist version of what Edgar's kind of dreamlike trip would have been like.
And what the two books also share is your fondness of telling stories within a story. People wander off in stories and dreams and.
Right.
So it's you seem to be very fond of detours, occasionally.
Yeah, or detours that come back. So it's like I'm fond of single narratives that run straight with. If I was to imagine it, it would be like sort of a single line with tracks that go off and then come back to the story.
Yeah.
I just read Middlemarch for the first time. And it's just this like vast interlacing, and sort of sat before this book stunned that such a novel could be written. I mean, stunned in complete amazement that so many different characters can interact in so many different ways. Because the way that I think tend to see the world, or tend to see the characters in these books, and tend to see the books that I want to write next, are all sort of single people moving through space and the world reflected through the lens of one person. And I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know why that's the case.
Yeah. It's more. It's like time flowing through a person or to a group of persons instead of the other way around, as the story is normally seen.
Right.
A person moving through time and things happening. Or is that a complicated metaphor?
You mean that like that the person is the filter?
Yes.
Yeah. That the person is a filter. I imagine a single filter for the story as opposed to multiple filters for the story.
Do these detours actually have to mean something in relation to the story? Are they little metaphors for something which is to be resolved later on in the book, or are they just there for their own purpose?
Yeah. No, that's a wonderful question. That came up all the time with writing this book, because in the piano tuner they always point back to a story, and the piano tuner is like an obsession with storytelling. So he hears the story of someone who experiences a world and can't return from it over and over and over again, whether it's an old man on a ship who tells him a story about hearing a song that was so beautiful that he couldn't return from it, or whether he hears a famous Burmese folk myth about a butterfly that sort of man's soul appears as a butterfly and flies around during the world while he sleeps, and you can't wake him, otherwise he'll pass away in his sleep. It's like the same story reiterated again and again. When I was writing this, I knew that could happen, and yet stories were even more essential, I think, for this book than the piano tuner, because she's essentially illiterate. I mean, she can read, but she can barely get through a sentence. And because she has no access to the technology that allows us to know about the events that would be occurring in the world, she essentially lives in a tradition of oral storytelling, like a very old oral tradition, in which her experience of the world, that which she does not experience herself, occurs through the stories of other people. I mean, as knowledge has been transmitted throughout history, she still lives in that sort of prehistorical state. So they're essential there. Like I couldn't avoid them, even if I was afraid of having that same kind of digressive structure that the first book had. And I was to great pains to not fall into the same patterns of the first book because I knew that the subject matter was different enough. I was afraid of that happening, and yet I needed those tools in order to describe her world. And so every single time she heard a story, that question, the exact question that you're asking, came up. And the simple answer is sometimes, in this case. But I tried to be realistic, because not all the time in our lives did everything reflect back on us. And yet at the same time, this isn't her life. You know that. This is 250 pages of her life.
Yes.
And so you hope that every bit that you get matters.
Well, actually, it's
somehow.
not a life at all. It's you.
Right, it's my imagining. It's my lens of her lens.
I mean, the difficult answer could be a paradox, because in the first book you draw in the reins as a director of the story, whereas in this book you let go, and then the story goes its own way, but it's still you.
Right, or I'm reined in. Like I sort of imagined it as like me in a maze.
Story directs you.
Right, or she, the character, directs me. That she was constantly...
Did you have that feeling that the character is directing you?
All the time. There was this, and it was never in a sort of, I would say, like exuberant way. It was in this restrictive way. So if I would write that Isabel is in the city and she's with her friends and she's experiencing the company of other girls her age for the first time essentially in the entire story up until that point. And I would think, well, you know, what a triumphant moment in a way. Finally, this person who's been alone essentially through the whole story has found a companion, and now I can kind of explore this. All of a sudden she would come in, and it really would say nothing to me because she's a very quiet character, but would sort of, in a sense, almost like stand there in her silent way with like the particular combination of kind of fear and quiet dignity that she has, and make me wonder, but wait a second, this is not a person who would be sharing gossip stories with another girl. She's still from the country. She doesn't know the city at all. This is still an unfamiliar world for her. And all those were doors all of a sudden shutting on the different possibilities because she's restricted. She's had all agency taken away from her at that point. And so very often I'd have to think about what is the tiny little thing that she can do in this situation to express herself in a world that's essentially not allowing her to express herself at all. And so in that case, she was sort of constantly coming in with a no. No, I can't do that. Like, no, I can't eat that food because I can't afford it, or no, I can't look at the scene because I've just been handed an apple for the first time and I've never had an apple before. Or no, the only thing I'm really thinking about in this scene is that they're wearing shoes and I'm wearing shoes, and my entire life up to this point I've never worn shoes. But now I'm in that class of people in the world that wear shoes as opposed to those that don't. And so those sort of restrictions were constantly directing the story. So it was like, the horse has no reins, or the author's stuck in the maze. Yeah. It's something else which decides it.
So what you're now explaining is a classical example of what's in creative writing schools as what's called show, not tell, not explain what they do, but show how they feel and behave by their actions.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
And their feelings and so on, and not putting yourself in between as an author.
Right, and that was true with the first book, just because I like that technique. I find that, and I don't know why that is. There's some particular joy, at least that I get, in the specificity that comes with a unique movement, as opposed to being told something. And I know I've read many books which, I mean, Middlemarch is a good example. There's both show and tell, but there's a lot of telling in that book. Emotions are worked through in every single possible detail. And it's still a masterpiece. So by no means is it a necessary thing to show and not tell. But there's some particular joy that I can't figure out. Like, I wish I knew the rule that explained why we feel a joy why we don't feel a joy if we read the character is sad. But for some reason we're able to picture it more vividly, that instead of that sentence is she is sad, she is very sad, it's written that like her hands tense ever so briefly when the word drought is mentioned, and that's it, and that's all you see. But it's like you're capturing this tiny little view into a person's world. And maybe it's like the sense that as a reader you've made this discovery yourself, that you've stumbled upon someone who's been hiding something from you the whole time, and you just caught this little bit you can see into the world. Now I'm speculating, I don't know, but for some reason it's richer that way when the subtlest action is revealed, and not just for her character, but like in any other book. I mean, I just read this short story by the Irish writer Colm Toibeen.
Say again, sorry?
The Irish writer Colm Toibeen.
Oh yes, Colm Toibeen, yeah. The Irish writer, yeah.
He has this new wonderful book called The Master that came out a couple years ago, and his new book of short stories. And he has a woman who's about to have her grocery store taken away from her because the bank's going to foreclose. And she's sitting there in front of the bank official, and he's telling her about that they're going to essentially, call in all of their loans at that point. And her reaction, it's this incredibly complicated scene. How do you portray somebody's sort of frustration and fear in that moment without explaining it? And he has her write out swear words. She has this habit where she'll write out swear words, spell them out with her finger on her dress so he can't see it. And as he's talking to her, all she's doing is she's writing, F, and then in the next letter, over and over again. And all of a sudden that action captures the whole sort of incredible sense of spiraling down that she's facing, as opposed to paragraphs and paragraphs of talking about how she sensed that she wouldn't be able to pull herself back up on her feet and so on and so forth. That action is that was your key, and I don't know why that is, but there's something very satisfying about coming across that.
And when you've done such a scene, it works.
I think so. I think that's one of those scenes, there's a lot of stuff in the book which feels really good. It's kind of it's like if you're drunk, you write it and you think it's really great, and then when you read it the next morning, it's not very good at all.
Yeah, but next morning it was still okay.
Those kind of scenes usually stick,
for
some reason or another.
Yes.
For some reason, those scenes, it's there's something a lot indisputable about those scenes. I think maybe because it's an action, and you can't argue with an action. If she's writing that on her skirt, she wrote it. It's not the author's opinion. It was written on the skirt.
So what happens to her now the book is finished, or the moment when you put in the last full stop and...
What happens to Isabel?
Yes. And she told Isaias how it would be.
Right.
Well, how would it be?
What happens in her life?
Or is it just don't go there?
In me, and to me, she lives. It's like the movie Groundhog Day. She's in the state of sort of perfect reincarnation. So the story in no way ends, and she's very present all the time. She still remains a great mystery to me, and the kind of speculation that went on at dinner with what would she be thinking if she was here having this meal goes on all the time. So the book didn't answer anything. I began deeply curious about what a person like her would have gone through, almost in this having to know kind of sense, and the book put off the need for that answer. Was a salve in some ways, because I felt like I was investigating it, but at the end of the day, I don't feel like I particularly understand her. I mean, we probably can't really understand any human being. We can't understand ourselves so well, but I feel like she still remains this total mystery for me. So if the story, I don't know what happens to her again in life. I mean, I imagine she gets older, and I sort of imagine and hope for a reasonably happy life for her. I mean, a happy life for her is not a particularly...
Well, this was her finest hour, wasn't it?
She withstands an experience which would be difficult for most people to withstand with dignity, probably.
In order to write a new book, would you have to abandon her, let her go?
Yeah.
And can you already do that, or is she still with you?
I could do it until this tour, till I started traveling around.
Right.
Yeah. The process of talking about her conjures her up. And so the book was finished in June of last year, so I had about 9 months before publication. Right. And I was able to write then, but knew that the second I would start going around and essentially bringing her back up again would make other writing very difficult. And I find that's the case, just the pace of the language. Sentences in this book run on the short side, and the words run on the hard side, and the words tend to be consonant heavy as opposed to vowel heavy. It's everything about it is there to create this sense of this gritty, difficult place. But I don't want to write my next book in a gritty, difficult place.
Right.
And so it means changing vocabulary and changing place. And so when I'm done, when I'm done doing this, I don't think I'm gonna. I haven't read the Piano Tuner again for 5 years.
Right. Okay. Well, I've got lots more questions, but this might look like a good moment to bring you in. So, is there anyone who wants to ask Daniel a question? Even the simple biographical questions. How did you become a writer? Or so, who can I hand the microphone? Go ahead.
Your stories are based in Asia. So is there a particular reason for this? Do you like to travel, or did you write a story that's based in the States?
I think I've thought about this. The first book was based in Asia because I'd been there. That definitely was because I'd like to travel, and I began the second book basing it in Brazil because I had been there and I was interested in traveling there. And I think partway along the way, I became almost a little disillusioned not with travel at all, but with the idea that seeing this other world was necessary for writing. And I think in some ways that occurred at the same time as this transformation from this historical novel into one which it takes place in another place, but is, in my mind, more psychological than I would say geographical in its differences. So now I feel like I'd very much like to write one set in the States. I think the reason why this ended up being set in this unnamed place that appears like Brazil, I thought for a while about setting the story using that example of people moving from the Deep South to the San Francisco Bay Area. I thought of setting it there. The problem was that with this particular story, I realized that in doing that, I was going to have to deal with issues which in the United States are huge issues that would have overwhelmed the story. So the most obvious one being if I said a story about someone coming from the Deep South and moving to the San Francisco Bay Area, I'd have to deal with questions of race. And that is like a vast subject that probably would have been too hard and complicated for me to handle and would have overwhelmed the story regardless. Like if I had done it well, it would have overwhelmed the story. And if I had done it badly, then it would have completely ruined the story. And so even though for a time I thought, well, maybe I should set this closer to home, it just didn't seem to fit there. When I think of other stuff that I'm going to write, it tends to be in other places, but it doesn't need to be. I like situations that put great stress on people, that demand a lot from the soul, that force a person to go through a trial. And I think that can happen anywhere, but I don't feel like that's particularly happened to me, say. I've been very fortunate that nothing really in my life has put the same sort of demands on me that are placed on the character in this book. I haven't been forced away from my family. I haven't gone through hunger. I haven't been forced to sort of abandon a traditional set of beliefs. And so to set it in my contemporary reality would be very difficult for me because it's the kind of character that I'm interested in. A lot of other writers deal with interactions of people and relationships between people where I think you can find sort of much more richness much closer to home. And you can definitely find great trials of the human spirit. Not though I feel like in my immediate world, which is the world of essentially pretty well-off middle-class Americans born in the suburbs. My life's pretty uninteresting for this kind of story. And even if I was to focus on Americans or people closer to home who've had more difficult lives, that's fine and that would be fair enough. The difficulty in that for me is that the closer I am to writing about the subject, the more in danger I am of inserting myself in. And I'm afraid of doing that. And so this, for instance, I wrote it from the perspective of a 14-year-old girl because that was the character that seemed necessary for the story. But I'm thankful that I wrote from that perspective because it made it difficult to insert myself into the character. And had she been a 30-year-old young man making this trip, it would have been very difficult for me to keep myself out. And every single time I went to ask those questions of, is it fair enough that she's thinking this? I don't know if I would have been able to answer that well because it might have been my own thoughts. So I need some sort of separation. If it's in the United States, fine. But there does, I feel, need to be some sort of separation for me to be able to feel to write freely so that I'm keeping my own experience out in the places where I need to keep my experience out. And that's a very long answer to your question.
But it does answer your answer does answer the question, which was about, do you need to be in exotic places in order to...
No, not at all.
No.
No.
Obviously not. I mean, because the story itself is not exotic. It's simply human.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that this is, like, there are people very close to me, friends and family, who've gone through similar sorts of experiences. But again, I felt that it would be more dangerous to write there, because then it becomes a story about that, as opposed to a story about someone who's as opposed to the story about the person that I wanted to write this story about.
Right. And anyone else? Yes, lady in the...
Actually, would love to hear about if you've been writing your whole life, but are you also writing about the social, making a social statement, like about poverty? Is this also behind your characters? The plight. So you're
Sure.
talking about the inner self.
Sure.
But is it also important to explain their social situation?
With this book in particular.
Yeah.
So the social world of these characters and like the political economic situation that's facing them was that it was important for her life was apparent to me from the start. And I think it's probably pretty clear from my decision to focus so much time thinking about a person like this, about where my politics lie. But I was afraid while I was writing that those sort of beliefs, especially because this is a very polarized issue in the United States right now, that those beliefs would end up getting in the way of the story. And so as a result, I tried to steer as far away from any sort of particular political prescription as possible, because I felt like it got in the way of the story, and my first role was to tell the story from her perspective. That said, at the end, if it has some kind of political role to play, which, unfortunately, given how many people read fiction and what kind of people read fiction, you usually end up just preaching to the choir and not so many of them, or rather small choir. But if it does play a role, or the role that I would see that a fictional book would play, would not be, say, to take for example, a hot issue would be in the United States, would be whether illegal immigrants should be allowed health care. And so, whereas I believe that it's a basic human right to be offered health care, it didn't feel like to put that belief into this book that explicitly was appropriate, and I felt that would have taken away from this character. So, for example, if Isabel had become sick at some point and she had gone to a hospital and she had been turned away from the hospital because she was illegal or she didn't have enough money, it would have been making a very strong political point. But I feel like it would have been too pointed. If it has any sort of political as an individual, and then when it comes time for them to make their own decision about whether health care should be offered to illegal immigrants, it's suddenly a lot more difficult for them to say no when they imagine that the person who they're denying that care might be someone that they walked along the road with a little while. And so in that case, the political purpose is there, but it's very indirect. It's to sort of give a sense of what another person would be like, to hopefully create some sort of sympathy for that person, which then instructs like a general, say a general approach to a problem. Sure.
Where did you study to become a writer? Did you study at university?
I took a creative writing class when I was in college, but for the most part, I've studied from other books, I think, like in reading and loving to read. And the wonderful thing about literature is that everything is there. It's very easy to learn in literature as opposed to painting. Today I was looking at Vermeer's, and I'll never be able to do that. Like, it's impossible for me to reproduce a Vermeer. Yet I could write Hamlet by opening it up and copying word for word Hamlet on the word processor. And like, in the end, you wouldn't be able to tell whether it was my Hamlet or Shakespeare's Hamlet. But I would never be able to do that with Vermeer. So, but I mean that in a very serious way, not just as a joke. That the example's there. Why Hamlet is fantastic is there. It's all there. I mean, there is something that a reader brings to the story also. There's this whole separate narrative that you bring. Like when you say it's a dark and stormy night, you also are bringing that experience. The experience is what you know happens on a dark and stormy night. And that one sentence then brings the whole world with it. But that, I have that with me. And so it's enough to just know what the other person's words are. So you can learn a lot by seeing what's laid out on paper, which is, as far as I know, really like no other craft in allowing you sort of such an insight to the bare structure of the work that's there, or works that have gone before you. Sure, thank you. Uh-huh. Sure. Okay. Why does my character have a name and why is it Isabel? So she has a name to keep the book from becoming too fable-like. That I think that although I didn't want the story to have a particular location, I'm a little bit afraid of the word fable, and I felt and expected and sort of rightly expected that a lot of the ways it seems to be being read, both in a positive and negative way, is that it's like, that somehow it exists out of time. A fable is something which has a lesson in it, which doesn't really happen. And fables rarely have it's not the role of a fable to have the psychological exploration of one of the characters that occur in a fable. You accept characters in a fable as archetypal characters, so in that sense they don't have the same sort of psychological complexity, I think, that real characters might. And I want it to be about her. And so a lot of the decisions, everything in here, the city's not named, the country is not named, but the places are named. So they're just named as places that could be anywhere. They're given saints' names. The characters all tend to have, they're mostly biblical names or classical names, which are names that could occur in any country. So Isabel in particular came with her from the start. So like when I imagined this girl on the cusp of adulthood, her name was Isabel. And I think one thing I liked very much about Isabel, and this is getting into like real particulars of sound and stuff, is that I wanted a name that other characters could use a nickname for, that other characters could abbreviate, to create a sense of affection between certain characters that would then be denied other characters. So she lives in this closed-off world, this very tight-knit community, which is extremely sort of stoical and wooden-faced to anyone in the outside world. There's like this circle of people. Yet there's great affection within that circle. And so I wanted a name that could reflect both sort of this formal presentation to this generally hostile world, and yet this more sort of personal, sympathetic one. So it needed to be a name that could have an affectionate nickname that sounded good. And then I liked the name because from her nickname, that affectionate nickname, I could then create her brother's name. Her brother's name is Isaiah, which is the double anagram of her name, which is not like it's a gimmick, but they're close. And it's just a way, hopefully, in reading his name has a resonance of her in it. And the story, I haven't talked about this very much, but the story is sort of a love story of sorts, not like a romantic love story, or not a sexual love story, but a sort of a brother and sister love story. She completes a side of him, and vice versa. They kind of have created each other to be something that they're not. And so having that sort of reciprocal nature of the names was important as well. I mean, there are all those little things. It was very nice, though. For a while, I was thinking of setting it in Brazil or in a specific place. And the wonderful thing about the name Isabel is it can kind of fit anywhere. And so, like, that name never went, whereas his name actually came and went, and other people's names came and went, but that name stayed.
So it actually underlines the general aspect of the story, the universal aspect of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that it could be anywhere. That she also, it's a name with many alternate spellings, and she plays around with that within the story in a way that kind of parallels her own attempt to define herself and who she is. She will spell her name at many different times. I mean, there's other little things I can say. Her name contains the word Sybil, which in classical mythology is a seer or a sorceress who has the ability to see to the side, which she also has. There are all these little bits about her name that I like.
Right. I hadn't thought of that, but
No,
now
there's
you
no
mention
way.
it.
The only clue that is when she misspells her name one time.
Yes,
She writes, and my editor said, "Is this a typo here? You've misspelled her name." I said, "It's not a typo."
Okay. Well, since no one else asks it, I will do so. We all know that you are trained to be a doctor, and at one point in your life you were doing research into malaria yourself. Then you went to medical school. So we would like to know, will you ever become a doctor, or have you become a doctor?
I've become a doctor in a very strict sense in that I have an MD, but I'm not
practicing.
Not practicing, and I haven't passed I haven't taken step 3 of my boards yet.
Right.
Very specific.
Will you ever do it?
What that means is that like if anyone got sick here, I wouldn't know what to do.
Right.
Okay. I don't know if I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
I'm working on a new book now, and it's.
Well, obviously, I ask it
all-absorbing.
with a reason, because I thought there's something he might have taken from the medical profession, which is the compassionate view into this book.
Yeah, no, I hope so. I feel like when I was writing it, there were times that I was afraid that would get in the way.
Mm-hmm.
Like Isabel's cousin, Manuela, has tough politics, sort of in my mind. She's not, I feel like she's sort of sympathetic here, but she's not sympathetic towards other people, and she wishes some nasty things on other people, and makes, that I feel diminishes, like it diminished her character in my mind in some ways, although I think it's real. And I think that I fought that a lot of the time because like I felt like after a while, after spending a time with these characters, I kind of had sympathy, I cared for them. Mm-hmm. And to give them beliefs that I found disagreeable was sort of difficult. So that's something that I think that you fight. I love Steinbeck. Steinbeck is an idol, but I find at times reading him now, there's this love of characters that sometimes gets in the way of them becoming more real people. That he has this incredible compassion for the characters, but sometimes there's some reason like I feel like he's being too kind to them for me. That's a new feeling that I've gotten. It's definitely not the feeling that I had a long time ago when I first began to read him, but that's a new feeling that I have. I think that in medicine you're constantly trying to figure things out about people. And so if it's not sympathy, at least it's that, like the curiosity is something that I feel like even if I don't practice medicine, is something that ends up influencing. And probably the reason why so many doctors become
putting
writers.
them under a magnifying glass.
You're trying to figure it out. Yeah, you want to know, like, why are they sick, first of all? What are they doing here? What was going on in their life beforehand? Like, what's wrong with them? Why are they doing this to themselves? Or just, like, who is this person who's suddenly coming into my room in front of me? Especially, depending on the kind of hospital that you're in, but especially in hospitals that treat people from really wide-ranging backgrounds. It's just, it's like a character like Isabel walks into the room, and all of a sudden you have somebody that's come from a world where she's never heard of the sea until she's maybe 5 years old, doesn't know it exists, and they're sitting in front of you. And there's very few other places where you're able to interact with such there's no other job I know that you're able to interact with such intimacy with people from so many different backgrounds. So I miss that incredibly.
Yeah. Anyone else with a question? Go ahead.
Also, besides Steinbeck, who are the authors you most admire?
It changes. It changes a lot depending on what I'm writing. So for this book, an author that I constantly went back to is Bruce Chatwin, and I think Chatwin, because he uses very specific language, and I felt that, like, because my sentences needed to be short, because this was not a character that was prone to long thoughts, sort of long philosophical digressions, I need to get as much accomplished in as little space as possible, and Chatwin's like a master of that. Deals with specific words very, very beautifully. Another author I love is now very sadly deceased German writer W.G. Sebald. Like the book Austerlitz I read while I was writing this, and it set me back 6 months. I couldn't write for 6 months after reading that book because the book was so good and written with such a strong individual voice that I that I didn't know what to do. Every single thing I wrote sounded like Austerlitz, and for those of you who've read Austerlitz, it's very different from this. It was not a good book to have.
Can I interrupt here? Because
Sure.
I find this very strange that you mentioned Chatwin and Sebald, because they are both regarded as sort of travel writers who put in a lot of fiction in their factual stories. And actually, there's a Dutch writer who invented a word, a term, a definition for this type of literature, which mixes journalism and factual writing with fiction. And he called it friction. And anyway, but you don't regard yourself as a travel writer, do you?
No.
And you don't regard Chatwin and Sebald as travel writers either. I
No.
feel.
No, I don't think so. Like I feel like Chatwin wrote different books in different places, but it was because he wanted to write different story ideas.
Yes.
And when he set forth to write a story, and maybe it didn't happen this way, but when it would happen, he may have been in a place when a story came to him, but when he finally said, "Oh, I want to write my next book about this," he had traveled very widely. He sort of started from the beginning and said, "I'm going to set this wherever's the best place to set it," and like that's something which definitely I kind of cling to at times when I feel like I am writing about some place which is far away from my experience. Like his example is fantastic. That each one of his books takes place in a different place, and at the same time, I feel like there's rarely a wrong note in them, or it doesn't matter. They're about, in a way, sort of the same thing, but in different places. Like he has themes that would run through his story, but they're in different places. And Sebald, I still don't know what to make of Sebald. Sebald, it's like such a strange, and the interplay of fact and fiction in Sebald, the use of photographs. He intersperses photographs throughout the narrative. The use of photographs to undermine this question of what's real and what's not is so unsettling.
And he also writes with an I as a main character.
Right.
But it's not I. I mean, it's not them. It's a fictional I.
Right.
I think.
And often it's not the I's story. So
yes,
it's the I, like in Austerlitz, the I tells the story of Austerlitz, but it's the I's experience for Austerlitz. So you don't know where you are, and it's one of those books where you end up running for the biography, if you can possibly find it, to try to figure out what's real or not, which I don't think one should do, but still it's sort of so commanding and feels so present that somehow it must be real.
Can I ask you, because we're running out of time and we have to draw it to a close quite shortly, I've a couple of more questions, just one brief question. When I read, for instance, the long, drawn-out sequence in the beginning, I thought that is very cinematic. It's like you're entering a movie, and where you have this long overture. Now I know that this book is being made into a film and into an opera, by the way. Did you at some point have the idea you were working on a film script?
I don't think I thought about that I was writing a film script. I'm definitely influenced by images that come from movies, though. Like I think that it's like if I was writing 100 years ago, the idea of writing a description from the viewpoint of a bird would have been completely speculative and would be read as speculative. Oh, this is what a bird might be able to see. I'm thinking of a line in the piano tuner in which it's sort of imagine what a bird would see as it's flying over the plateau and seeing them. But I think that for those of us who've flown in airplanes and seen movies in which scenes are shot all the time from helicopters, that's a familiar world to us, and we understand that. And I think I draw from that when I'm writing, and probably imagine that people would sort of see it the same way when they're reading it.
But there's also quite a lot of special effects in the book. I mean, where Isabel, for instance, imagines, I think it's somewhere toward the end, where the people actually moving backwards, and when the clouds are moving in the opposite direction, she forces them in the opposite direction, which you could easily do in film.
Right. Imagine them streaking backwards. No, I think that probably very much comes from having that in my mind as I write, like that being an influence. I mean, I felt with the piano tuner that I was probably more influenced, the piano tuner, by Apocalypse Now than I was influenced by Heart of Darkness.
Well, the idea occurred. I thought this Mr. Carroll had something of Kurtz
Right.
in Heart of Darkness, obviously.
Yeah.
I thought it was an anti-Kurtz in
It's
a
like
way.
an anti-Kurtz, yeah.
The anti-Kurtz. Anyone else with a question? If not, then I thank you very much for being here and talking so elaborately about your book and so moving as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, no, thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel Mason, for your lecture and for your very long, eloquent answers. And thank you very much, Hans Stekkete, for your very good questions. And I also would like to thank you, the audience, for your questions as well. I would like to thank the Bezig Bij for their cooperation on this evening. I would like to thank all the volunteers who helped out tonight and my staff, Kobe Evans. I think that most of you know the John Adams Institute, but I would like to mention very quickly that we are a non-profit organization and we depend completely on our supporters. So if you're not a member or you would like to become a volunteer, you can get some more information at our information stand, or you can come up to me personally. And I would like to mention here our upcoming program. I will mention on the 12th of April, we will have Ariel Levi with her book Female Chauvinist Pigs. And our next lecture in The Hague will be with Niall Ferguson, The War of the World, on the 22nd of May. And I think that's really something where you should come to, because he's one of, I think, the best historians we have right now and one of the youngest. Thank you for coming here, and if you would like to have your book signed, you can buy a copy over there, and Mr. Mason will be sitting here on stage. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you again.